started in just a minute here.
We missed that first part, Mark. It was
You can
technical.
start the. Yeah, I probably do have a few issues with the internet connection that I have. Kendra can step in here also, and Olivia. Let's see. So this is the meeting of the entire work group. Olivia, did you want to go over the agenda that we have set up for today?
Sure thing. First we're going to start out with the usual summaries from each one of the leads, each one of the chairs. Then we are going to have a presentation from Patty.
Oh, okay.
Mark, are you trying to say something? Sorry.
I think go ahead, Olivia.
Okay, Katrina and team. And then we do have a bit of room for discussion there because we know that there are going to be questions and others. And then we are going to have a bit of a discussion about what next steps are. We are approaching the halfway mark and time is beginning to wind down. So we want to be sure that everybody is on the same page and can provide feedback as to what they would like to see for the next steps of the working groups. And then of course we will have room for public comment at the end like we usually do. Take it away, chairs. We have Angie, are you able to go first with the requirements work group?
I sure am. I did my homework.
Yeah.
I was not at the requirements subgroup, so I watched the video. And I've taken some notes on it. And the main part of the discussion on the requirements subgroup had to do with the language extending reincarceration and whether that should be limited to just registration offenses and crimes against the person or some other more narrow group. It seemed like in general, people thought on the survey, like 11, I think of the 14 thought there should be some limitation on the extensions. And that list seemed like a really good starting point. A couple of people suggested that maybe the weapons offenses shouldn't be included, like the illegal possession of a weapon. I mean, not the weapon use offenses. And then there was a suggestion that maybe offenses that were missing from that list that might be added for extending terms would be like terroristic threats or violation of no contact orders. So, and then there was some discussion about reduction of risk based on time crime free in the community, kind of connected with the discussion on which crimes should extend registration. And there was brief discussion about the lifetime registration for certain offense subdivisions and how those are related to risk if they're not. And actually, I emailed Brian as I was listening to the recording and asked him if I send him the language from the subdivisions, if that's something that he might comment on at a future meeting, maybe on the lifetime subdivisions, if those have factors that are associated in any way with risk, just so the group would have that information. And that's something he said he could do. We're going to work on that. Maybe I told him I'd get stuff to him by the end of this week on that. And then the other part of the discussion in the group was the extension for failure to register convictions, whether there should be one, what that should look like. Some talk about those not in the the research showing that those don't necessarily increase risk. There was a discussion of getting race breakdown data for failure to register offenses. The Sentencing Guidance Commission indicated they have that data or can provide that data. So that's something that I think is going to be looked into. They reviewed the racial breakdown of the registry. Also, there was discussion about whether there should be a mandatory minimum penalty for failure to register. And currently, there's a mandatory minimum that the prosecutor can make a motion to waive, or the court can waive on its own motion for substantial and compelling reasons. And there was some discussion about whether there should be a mandatory minimum and that there's not a lot of incentive to plead guilty. So there are a lot of trials that go because of that issue. There was some also discussion of re-triggering, of whether judges should have some discretion to change the period of triggering. There was talk with the mandatory sentence that affected the compliance rate, and that it did go up significantly once the penalties were more serious for failure to register. It went from like 30-some% to 90%, at least in Hennepin County. And there was brief discussion about the forms and whether they can be easier or not, or do they, since they only include what's required by statute, is that kind of the best that they can be simplified? And then because the compliance rate is pretty high, maybe the forms are fine. They seem to be figuring it out. So I think that's about it.
Sheriff, you're up. And thank you, Angie.
Good morning. So in the crimes subgroup, we started out looking at the poll that was sent to this subgroup, and that addressed 3 items: whether juveniles should be required to register, and then there were 2 items that talked about same set of circumstances. There was support for having juveniles have to register only for EJJ registration. There was some support for eliminating the same set of circumstances. Both of those polls came in kind of close to 60-40. And then there was one poll that talked about whether we wanted to eliminate the issue revolving around false imprisonment and how that pulled people into same set of circumstances, maybe that weren't necessarily envisioned as folks who were to be in the registry when the registry was created. So given that there was some very broad support for that, that's where the subgroup started, and that conversation took up basically all of the rest of the conversation for the subgroup. We talked about various ways that we could find to separate out individuals who get caught up in same set of circumstances that have committed domestic violence versus individuals who get registered because they've committed a false imprisonment in connection with a sex crime or a predatory offense. So there was a few ideas that came out of that. One idea was to change the statute and basically rewrite it so that you define the crime of the crime of false imprisonment as restricting someone's child when you don't have the ability to, restricting someone's freedom basically in a domestic situation, and then restricting someone's freedom in all others. And then you would kind of in a negative sorting method say that those who restrict someone's freedom in a domestic situation don't qualify for the same set of circumstances registration. There was some other discussion about, well, maybe we would want to do that in a positive inclusion way, where you define that crime as committing false imprisonment while also committing or attempting to commit a sex crime or a predatory offense. So those were the two thoughts that came away from that meeting. And I did my best to kind of stumble my way through some attempts at changing statutory language and sent that to the co-chairs. And at the co-chair meeting, Angie brought up maybe a better way and a more elegant way to do this would be to draft language that said same set of circumstances would remain a registerable offense, but would not be subject to the same set of circumstances attachment to registration. So we need to flesh that out a little bit more. But I think that's kind of where we came away in the crime subgroup, was with the desire to somehow address this issue of same set of circumstances ensnaring these folks who are involved in domestic violence situations. And we agreed to defer the talk on juveniles until after we had the presentation regarding juveniles and EJJ that's coming up next week. And then the second set of same set of circumstances situation, we again kind of deferred the talk on that issue of eliminating or keeping that depending upon what the outcome was of the language that would eliminate the folks that get snared up in the domestic violence crimes. So I think that's a pretty exhaustive summary.
Angie?
Just to clarify, I don't know, I mean, maybe I just misunderstood what you said, Troy, but what we discussed with the false imprisonment is assuming the same set of circumstances stays in the statute for offenses, basically taking false imprisonment out. So having that be an offense that you would have to register for a conviction for false imprisonment, but not for anything arising out of the same set of circumstances. So false imprisonment still require conviction, but not out of the same set of circumstances. And that for that particular offense. And then the other offenses would remain same set of circumstances, assuming that stays in the statute.
Concur. Thank you.
Stacy?
Okay.
And thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to give an update on the methods subgroup. The methods subgroup, to remind everyone, is looking at mostly what we're looking at is considering a process to request a petition for removal or create a process for registrant to petition for removal during their presumptive 10 or lifetime registration period. So that was really the focus of the discussion. A lot of kind of sub issues bubbled up, which I'll try to articulate as best I can. We talked about, so community notification came up as being an issue, and trying to understand how that related to the registration requirement. We know that community notification happens only in level 3s. And then I think it was suggested that there be an entire working group around community notification, or there certainly could be from a substantive standpoint, because it's such a complex and broad topic. There's a desire to know what has been happening in other states for a petition for removal process. How are they handling it? The CSC working group supplemental report had suggested a first cut at a petition for removal process that was largely modeled off of the expungement statute. There's various issues with that, and there was a concern about the proposed language from the CSC working group that a court shall grant a petition, that there was really no discretion. So there's concern about that. And there are many issues with that first draft that we came up with that we are continuing to look at. I will say at the end of the methods subgroup meeting, we decided to have a subgroup, which is something that we did for people who are familiar with the CSC working group. A couple of the subgroups broke out into subgroups where more substantive work could happen. And they were comprised of, just a few people. So at the end of the methods subgroup, we decided that a subgroup could take a look at really digging into what would a petition for removal process look like. And Brian and Renee and I comprised that subgroup, and we had a meeting yesterday. I think it was yesterday. Was it yesterday? This week is starting to
It was
become a
yesterday. yes.
blur. Was it? That was yesterday. And just in terms of coming up at our first meeting was really conceptually based, like what are the concepts that we want to work with for a petition for removal? What would it look like generally? So we're starting to work on that. But back to the methods subgroup, some other issues that came up, and I don't know if Representative O'Neill is here today, but Representative O'Neill has been, a leader in the rape kit testing priority and getting untested rape kits tested. And so there's some concern that when we talk about recidivism, do we really know what the recidivism is with all these untested rape kits? And so we were trying to understand the intersection between the untested rape kits and the recidivism that we think we understand. There was a comment made that, well, recidivism research is national, and a lot of it, I think Brian has cited, research from Canada. So that's a larger body of information, but we have a few thousand untested rape kits in Minnesota, and we're trying to understand what does that mean? Are these repeat offenders? So that's an issue that we talked about quite a bit, was the rape kits and understanding what does that mean. And what we do know about the rape kits is once they're tested at BCA isn't doing like BCA doesn't, their job is to test the kit and then send it back to the law enforcement agency. And then the law enforcement agency, coupled with the county attorney, can decide what to do with that information. But there's no cross-reference on, is this identified person currently a registrant? And we thought that that would be a nice thing to know, but we're not sure who would do that or when or how. But if we're testing the rape kits, is there a way to say, okay, of these rape kits, who is a current registrant?
And I'm sorry to interrupt, Representative Mueller, you had a question, I believe, for Stacy?
Oh, I did. I just wanted, as you were talking about how you would model that petition for removal, there is a bill, the Clean Slate Act. It didn't pass last session, but I know that many of the agencies involved here, the courts, BCA, are working on with the author and looking at some of the language. And so I just wanted to make people aware of that, because there is if I recall it right, there is a sort of a petition process baked into that bill. So it just might be useful to be aware of it and look at that as you're working on language for this petition.
Yeah, that'd be great. Is that related to the registry, or is it related to another?
It's more related just to collateral consequences in general, and I think expungement too, but I'm happy to connect with you afterward and connect you to the author of that legislation too, if you want to figure out where it is in the process.
That would be great. That's great to know. There's from law enforcement, there is a concern that, well, the registry is not about supervision. It's a list of potential suspects in an unknown crime. And a small chance is still a chance. And these are these are words coming from Sheriff Heck according to my notes. But I want to make sure that that part is heard. And so, you know, the issue is, what is the criteria for someone who would want to petition for removal? What do they need to show? What kind of showing needs to be made? And what is the level of the showing? Is it preponderance? Is it clear and convincing? And what does that mean? So, you know, that's another countervailing concern. Another issue that came up is how the registry is actually functionally being used by law enforcement agencies. When it was shared that Mark had said when he does community or public notification meetings, one of the common questions that are asked of local law enforcement is how often, when you're investigating a sex crime, does the suspect end up being someone from the registry? And the information he's getting back is the answer is that it's almost never. And so does that mean that the sex crimes are being committed by people who aren't on the registry? And if that's the case, then we need to understand exactly the value of the registry.
And I just want to also insert something here. We did try and figure out who Mark was talking to. We have yet to get that information because if they are not actually working on sex crimes, then no, they wouldn't use the registry to solve sex crimes. And on top of that, you know, Josh has repeatedly stated that he uses the tool for that very purpose. So we take issue with a couple of those statements.
Okay, yeah, I mean, this is all anecdotal. And I think this was for local law enforcement. In any event, but that kind of spurred this question of, well, what is the data that we have on how the registry is being accessed by law enforcement, how much, and for what purpose? And there was a data request that I had put to the BCA back in 2020, and I pulled up in the methods subgroup the results of that data request, which was just a really broad request of what agencies and how many times over a 10-year period had the registry been accessed. And it included all law enforcement agencies that would have access. So it included corrections. So we looked at that data, and like in 2018, I think there were around almost 700,000 hits on the registry. And so one of the questions I asked was, you know, of those 700,000 hits, you know, what does that number mean? You know, and what is being used for investigative purposes of a sex crime? What numbers are updating information or tracking? What does that number mean? And over a 10-year period, it was almost 6 million hits on the registry. So again, I'm not sure what we do with those numbers, except the numbers are, you know, the numbers are the numbers. What do they mean? I think it's still unclear. So one of the ideas that's been talked about is, can we get data from law enforcement about how often they are accessing the registry to solve a sex crime, and using that information that they otherwise wouldn't have in other investigative tools. So the unique information that's contained in the registry that wouldn't be contained in a criminal history, how many times is that unique information on a registry and being used to solve a particular crime? And talking about, how do we get that information? What does that look like? Is it a sampling of local law enforcement? Is it all law enforcement? And how would that data be gathered? Let's see. for the ramp off or the petition for removal, there's discussion about should it be a specialty court? Should it be an administrative panel? I'll just tell you that our subgroup in discussing this yesterday believes that an administrative process is more fitting, similar to the ECRC, which is the End of Confinement Review Committee. And that's for people who are confined in the DOC correction system, and they set the leveling for sex offenders. So the thought is it would be very similar to that. So that's kind of the direction we're heading in terms of a recommendation. Let's see. I think that's it. I think that summarizes the work of the methods group.
Okay. Let's see here. What is up next?
Just so, I just wanted to respond to that issue about speaking with law enforcement over my 20 years, that is not just a one-time occurrence. And I think Sheriff Heck, Chief Tuscan, County Attorney Baker can all speak to that issue about those they are investigating for a sex offense. That is a common truth, is that most of the people who are investigated are not currently on the registry, that it is a new group of people when they get reports of sexual offenses. So there might be a misconception that all sex offenses are committed by people who are on the registry. That's not the truth. It doesn't take away from the value of the registry for investigating those rare, stranger, unknown type offenses. In no way does it take away from the value of that. But the reality is most people who get investigated are not on the registry.
Hey, I just, once again, I know I've said this before in other meetings. My unit is the predatory crimes section unit. We run the predatory offender registry. I have, 10 civilians working on that registry. And then across the state, we have 15 agents who specifically work on predatory crimes along with the local agencies. And I'll say it again, we use the registry as a tool to identify suspects, to get information that we wouldn't readily have available any other way but for the registry. For example, if they have a secondary address and we're looking for them, and if there's an Internet Crimes Against Children case and they're accessing an IP from a different address and we can't figure out where that is, a lot of times we'll go, okay, what other secondary addresses do they have? Where do they work? We wouldn't know that sans the registry. Okay, we wouldn't know what vehicles they drive sans the registry. We wouldn't have a good picture of them or their tattoos sans the registry. We wouldn't have an idea of any other victims they would have had that fit the description or fit the MO that we're currently investigating them for. So I don't know who's saying that. Yes, some people are not on the registry who we're investigating, correct? But a lot of the people we are, and we find out a lot of information from being on the registry. Plus, the folks that are on the registry, when we're investigating, we end up taking those people federal a lot of times. And the reason that we're able to do that is because we have the information that they're convicted of another crime before, and then they're predatory offender registry. And it's one of the caveats that the AUSA's office wants to see prior to taking a case from ours. So it bothers me. I've been, police officer for 28 years, and over 12 of them have been here in the predatory crime section. And I'm telling you, we use it all the time, and locals use it as well.
Sheriff Hack, I think you had your hand up. Stacy, let me know if I'm wrong. I'm sorry, I can't quite tell.
Doesn't matter. You can go first.
Oh gosh, we're gonna Minnesota it.
I'll
Stacey,
go.
ahead.
I'll go. That's fine. Yeah, so, right, no one, I don't think anyone in this room is saying that there's not a place for the registry. I think it's just trying to understand exactly how it's used. And that's really helpful to hear, from you, Josh, about how your office is using it. I think one of the interesting things that came out of the methods subgroup, and Representative O'Neill isn't here, so I'm gonna retell what I understood her to say and what my notes are saying here from the minutes. But she said that the average, just in Wright County, this is just a for example, the average yearly reports of rapes in Wright County is 12. And so when we look at that number, like assuming that's, Wright County is a large county, if they've got 12 reports of a rape, or she said rape, so I don't know if that's all sex crimes or just rape, but then it is out of those 12, for example, how many of those had an unknown suspect, and then which required pulling on the registry to identify suspects and clear suspects. So that's just that's just one number out of one county. And so the curiosity I think I have is, how are the local law enforcement agencies, coupled with Mark's kind of experience in talking with local law enforcement and understanding of the unknown crimes that are being researched, and then maybe some of the known crime, or unknown suspects. And then, maybe there's known suspects, but we don't know how to find them, or we don't know where they are, like the secondary address thing that you mentioned, Josh. What places is the registry actually fulfilling this investigatory function for law enforcement? And that's the data. I think we don't have data on it. And it seems to me that if we're going to have 18,000 people on it on any given year or day, that it would be helpful and important to know how it is actually being used from a data-driven standpoint.
Sheriff? And then I'm sorry, I'm going to cut us off so that we can go on to the next kind of phase here.
Thank you. I'd just like to echo Stacy's concern about data and express my discomfort in trying to conceptualize anecdotal evidence. Certainly, there are many cases we work where the suspect is not on the registry because the suspect has not already committed a sex offense, but there certainly are also many cases we investigate where the suspect is already on the registry. I just want to again touch on, in my view, the registry is conceived for this very small end of the funnel, rare case where we have the stranger on stranger sexual assault and predatory crime that happens very, very rarely. And so the idea behind it is to solve this very important, very critical case with this tool of names that might be our suspect, and using all this information we gather on that person to help sort out whether or not that person is or is not our suspect in these very, very rare cases. I will also echo what Josh was saying about some of the other secondary uses that you get with this registry and all the information that's collected, because even if, for example, we have someone who the perpetrator is known to the victim and the victim tells us about what happened to them, we can bolster our confidence that this is the right person, and perhaps bring this evidence into court if we can get the right argument before the judge to say, well, look, the victim has described this pattern. We go to the registry. They've already shown that there is this other pattern and it matches. There's a lot of things that we can use the registry for to help bolster this case that the person that's accused of this crime has done that. And these are all things that the registry helps us with.
Thank you. So up next, no pressure, Katrina and team, if you are ready to present, Mark and Kendra are going to have to give you the access to do so, but go forth.
That's good. I'm going to share my screen here if possible. Can everyone see the PowerPoint? I see Sheriff Eck nodding. All right. So appreciate the time on the agenda today. Patty, Brian, and myself will be walking through this PowerPoint. Super appreciate Patty and Brian's collaboration on this PowerPoint. It's been really great just pulling research, and I think Patty did such a good job at setting us up in the beginning with a good basis of that research. And so really what we did is we built upon that, and then taking into account some of the conversations that we've had, knowing that juveniles have come up in quite a few of the conversations. And so really just wanted to have a baseline of research and knowledge that's recent here. And also just want to thank Janine also for sending over some research as well. So I'm going to start. Patty and Brian will jump in as they see fit. I'm getting a little bit of an echo. Is anyone else hearing an echo on their end? Okay, good. I'm just going to keep going through them. So what we know, this is really about looking at, really how we have started to kind of break down some of the things we know about juvenile registration here in Minnesota, based on the data that was given to us by the BCA on 8/3/2021. There are 38 juveniles currently on the registry. The age breakdown, there's 33 kids that are between the ages of 16 and 17. There are 5 kids between the ages of 14 and 15. And then the race breakdown, there are 30 youth who are white, 3 that are Black, and 5 that are Indigenous youth. And so here in Minnesota, the delinquency age for juveniles is 10 to 17. And so here we register juveniles even younger than the federal requirements, as young as 10 years old. And regardless of when a juvenile begins registration, they will go into their adulthood, a minimum of 2 years, but more commonly 6 to 8 years. And then also, just to point out, this is something that I know has come up in quite a few of the conversations, but the number of former juveniles now registering as adults is obviously far greater than the 38 on the registry. I can't see hands either. So if there's somebody who raises their hand, Olivia, will you just interrupt me? Awesome, appreciate it. So risk factors for sexually problematic behavior, you'll see SPB in some of the slides moving forward. And so just want everyone to know that that's what that is. And really some of these things have come up in other areas, but really want to just indicate and point out that, many times early theories really felt that sexual abuse was a predominant contributing factor to future problematic sexual behavior. And research does not find that to be true anymore. And so that is some factors that, I think we should keep in mind as we look at these things. As research has progressed and our knowledge base has progressed, we can kind of take those things into account. A 2009 study found that juveniles were more likely than adult offenders to commit illegal sexual behavior in groups, which of course Patty has pointed out numerous times. And then a 2013 study found that once a sex offender, always a sex offender assumption is not supported with the juvenile sex offender population. And so we often hear that, but it doesn't bear true when we look at the evidence that we have through research. Some of the other contributing factors that research indicates, there's a wide variety of things, but really tried to make sure that we had a good list on here that was supported by a couple different research studies. It goes from everything from maltreatment, social isolation, anxiety, low self-esteem, all the way to exposure to violence. And so you can have a lot of contributing factors that may come into play, but it's really based on these other factors and not what we really believed in the beginning, that it was really perpetuated by previous sexual abuse. A 2015 study found findings that were consistent with many other longitudinal studies that we've looked at. And they indicated two main things: that the onset of sexually abusive behavior in adulthood can occur at the absence of history of sexually problematic behavior in adolescence. So just because you commit an offense as an adult doesn't necessarily mean that you had this behavior prior in your juvenile experiences. And then the percentage of sexually abusive behavior in adolescence and adulthood is the exception rather than the rule. So victims, really want to be aware of how we are looking at this and making sure that we are looking at this through a lens that is inclusive of all factors. And so wanted to talk through the potential victim pool that is most notably seen in research when it comes to juveniles and their behavior. And most notably, youth with problematic sexual behavior engage with these behaviors with siblings or other family members or youth they know, such as schoolmates or neighbors. I think that's one thing that Patty has continued to bring up in these conversations, is that really a lot of times juveniles know who their victims are, and there's some sort of relationship to them. The 2009 study also compared nearly 14,000 juvenile offenses with more than 24,000 sex offenses committed by adults. And they found that juveniles committed a greater number of peer-on-peer cases than expected, which challenged the notion that based on some clinical research samples, that juvenile sex offenders are preying on children much younger than them. And so I think that that's an interesting factor when you look at this larger pool of offenses and not necessarily juveniles who are seen in those clinical samples. 2015 study with 230 youth found that 63% of adolescent onset offenders knew their victims more than a year before they committed the incident. And so I think that links directly into, peer on peer, as well as schoolmates, neighbors, or family members. And then they also delineated some of the information further, pointing out some of those subgroups. So you can see siblings, cousins, biological siblings, and step siblings are delineated out. And then you also had the peer groups and family and friends or neighbors. And so they did delineate those out based on the percentages, knowing that they are important to know the differences in potentially family versus friends or peers or neighbors. Treatment and the effectiveness of treatment. This is one thing that I think has come up. I think in Brian's research has shown treatment has become more effective over time. And I think that's shown in the recidivism rates. You'll see that in the next slide. But really, the evidence has shown that really kids can do well in treatment, and if it's the right treatment. And I think we've gotten better and better at being able to focus in on treatment that makes sense for kids, that is specific to kids. It's not just an adult treatment base that we're then applying to juveniles. The field has really tried to make sure that we're being intentional around kids. And that we're putting kids in a position where they can be successful in the long term. And so I think it's increasing those standards in what those treatments look like and making sure that that treatment is consistent as well. The main thing I want to point out on this side is that evidence supports that these youth who have problematic sexual behavior are highly responsive to short-term community-based treatments. Many times we send kids to long-term treatments, especially with this population, but they are finding that some of those more family-focused, I think the last bullet point, the promising treatment approach included developmentally sensitive, targeted, short-term cognitive behavioral interventions that include the adolescent, family and caregivers, and other community supports through family and group therapy. So really working with not just the kid, but the world that revolves around that kid is really important in making sure that we're creating safe environments, not just for the kid, but for those who are surrounded by them. And we've just really seen an increase in that intentionality around that. And then the 26 study found that based on an average follow-up period of 5 years, the researchers found an average sexual recidivism rate of 7.37%. in treated juveniles. By comparison, the average sexual recidivism rate for the comparison group members was 18.93. So that treatment aspect of this is really important when it comes to that recidivism, and knowing that that treatment is truly based on not only working with the kid, but the families and the community. I heard somebody, does somebody have their hand raised?
Sorry, it's Olivia.
Okay.
Sherry has a question if there are specific dynamic and static testing tools used on juveniles, similar to the tools that we discussed with adults.
Brian, I might let you jump in here because you probably know them the best.
When Janine, you can back me up on this too if you can feel the need to jump in, but there are some more static actuarial instruments used on juveniles that have committed sex offenses. Again, not my specific area. I work with the adult tools more, day to day. So in terms of the effectiveness and things like that, but I have some knowledge that there is some available in terms of, I don't know about dynamic instruments, but there are a few. The problem is, again, the base rate for recidivism is really low in this population, as you just mentioned, Katrina. So the validity of the tools is, in question on some level. But I don't know if Janine, if you have anything more to add there, or anybody.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Is about the Professor, which is a new tool that's out there, and JSOP is out there. It's the history of development of assessment tools for people who've committed offenses at all ages. We have access to data, of course, for people who are of majority age on. And when you get down into juveniles, you run across different jurisdictions and different ways of gathering that data. That's not as clean and not as consistent across ways. So the evolution of tools for juveniles is not as far along, generally speaking, as the many decades now that we have of adults. But there are some tools that are being used, and Rhonda's using, Rhonda Dish just commented on the Professor, which is the latest. And as a commercial, we're doing a training on that at the Manatsa conference this spring.
Thanks, Rhonda and Janine, for the contribution. Katrina?
Great, thank you. So recidivism. We have talked a lot about recidivism in this group, so I'm not going to talk about it too much here. But recidivism is low for kids. You can see in 2000, from 2000 to 2010, for sexual recidivism was 2.75. For any recidivism was about 30%. And then you look at the years further back, 1980 to 1995, higher recidivism rates there for both the sexual recidivism and any recidivism, 10.3 and 34.47 respectively. And so really what we've seen is this treatment is part of what they attribute this reduce in recidivism, is that we're getting better at this. Of course, there's other factors that could come into play as well, but across many research areas, sexual recidivism is extremely low for juveniles. And one thing I thought was really interesting in the research provided strong evidence that juveniles who sexually offend are not only very low risk of sexual reoffending, but the juveniles who had sexually offended are actually at lower risk than non-sex offending peers of reoffending. So really being brought into the system and having that treatment or having the contact with law enforcement, the criminal justice system, is really having an impact on that recidivism rate. We are seeing that recidivism lower. I wanted to make sure that we touched on the federal requirements. So I put up, of course, the language with the federal requirement and put it in bold, just what the juveniles are, just to make sure that we're keeping that on our radar when we're having these conversations. Requires registration of juveniles who are 1, were 14 years of age or older at the time of their offense, and 2, were adjudicated delinquent of offense equivalent to or more severe than aggravated sexual abuse. I know Angie has got a lot into this, and so I'm not going to belabor this point, but wanted to make sure we are aware of it and it's staying on our radar as we're having those conversations. So this was something that I know quite a few people were interested. Took me a while to figure this out because there has been changes, of course, in laws over time, and things have changed based on depending on what report you read. And so I was able to touch base with some national partners as well to make sure this was the most accurate and current information we have. And so the states in gray, which are also articulated here on the right, are the states that do not require juvenile registry. Now, there are other states within here that require juvenile registry, but it's for extremely limited things. Certain states only require juvenile registry for rape, for example. Some states don't require certain things for individuals when they're a registrant of their state, but then of course have different registry requirements for kids coming into their state. And so there is a lot of minutia when you get into what this looks like on the local level or on a state level in certain jurisdictions. For example, Pennsylvania is a state I really struggled with getting accurate information on, and was able to find out that they have very limited scope in who they register as juveniles, and they actually don't register anyone into adulthood on limited circumstances into adulthood. So even if your case is certified into the adult system, if your offense occurred under the age of 18, we're still not seeing those on the registry. And so states are different, but these are the states that have that blanket no registry for juveniles, knowing that as you dive in a little bit more. I did get a report from a national organization that I'd be happy to share with the group that really dives into the differences in between each state, not only what their registration requirements are, but other requirements like how long they're on the registry, if there's a way to petition off, other things like that. So I'd be happy to share that with this group. Harms of the registry. I think this is something Patty has done an excellent job making sure that we're all aware of the harms of the registry. There was a large study back in 2013 by the Human Rights Watch where they interviewed nearly 300 individuals who had been affected by juvenile registration and notification requirements. And some of the things that they pointed out were some of the things that we have heard from Patty in the past, that the collateral consequences of these policies, of course, stigmatize youth. They have potential for isolating youth. They have shame and depression because of being on the registry, which then, of course, can affect their mental health and other factors in their lives. Suicidal ideation was something that's brought up in a couple different studies, that it's not uncommon in this population, and that suicide attempts, both completed or not completed, are something that the research is looking at because they know that it is a risk for this population. Of course, many things that we've heard even from the individual who came and spoke about their own experience, denying access to education, facing frequent moves, being able to not able to maintain stable employment or housing. Of course, if you're 10 years old when you're placed on the registry and you're on the registry for that 10 years, you could be trying to get into college during that time. You'd be trying to leave your family home. And so knowing that regardless of when a kid is placed on the registry here, it goes into their adulthood. I think these are really important things to make sure that we're thinking through, because we are going to have kids who are going to be denied certain things that would be really helpful to them in the future based on this registry. And I think the last one.
I'm sorry, we have a question from Stacy. Do we know of the juvenile offenders, how many were victims themselves before offending?
So the research does go into this. This is one area, that we historically, the research really believed that, and the field believed that sexual abuse in your younger years maybe contributed to sexually problematic behavior in the future. And that's not something that's supported by the research. I see that Janine has her hand up, and I will defer to her because I know she has a wide variety of expertise in this. So I'll defer to you, Janine.
I don't know about that, but I do know that the research with regard to youth is that the stronger predictor around the types of abuse in their past is actually neglect. So neglect comes up stronger as a predictor, which is consistent with some of the nuances in here about family systems, right? So when there are some teasing outs of past negative experiences, it's a neglect and emotional abuse that is a stronger predictor than sexual abuse.
Yeah, thank you. And then I think the last bullet point on here is really important to remember that even though we're only registering the juvenile, there's many more people that are affected by the registry. Parents, of course, family members, not only family members that are in their family, but if you live in a small town, it is, something that I think can affect not only the kid, but even their broad family. And so, and then also those failure to register requirements, of course, impact juveniles in an unfortunate way, because their capacity to be able to make sure that they're staying compliant with those things may be a little bit different than adults. So this slide really just speaks to, and I know Patty wanted to jump in on this side, because this really speaks to making sure that how kids are properly developing is something that we're supporting through the juvenile justice system. And really, this study in 2006 really talked about protective factors and really what makes kids successful. And they delineated quite a few factors in here that they said were vital protective factors, but one of the most important ones was that emotional expressiveness was, of course, a huge part of this. Having a confidant, strong desire to not harm others, favorable sense of self, all these things that we know are important for kids. Any kid you have in your life, you would hope that they feel these things and that they're supported and that they're fostering this environment that allows them to grow in this environment. Of course, the registry, has an effect on these protective factors. And so, based on the research, the more we can surround kids with protective factors, the more their risk goes down, right? And so we really want to make sure that we're putting kids in position to have the lowest level of risk possible. And by surrounding them with these protective factors, by supporting these protective factors, building these protective factors into not only a kid's everyday life, but also how we work with them and their families is really important to make sure they're successful. And the registry at times limits the ability to really highlight or be able to function specific to some of these protective factors.
I'll jump in and just add, if we go back to one of the original slides showing the contributing factors to becoming or being identified as a child with problematic sexual abuse, I'm going to read these and you see what, kids need to feel safe. They need physical support, physical, social, emotional support, but the factors that contribute to problematic sexual behavior: maltreatment, so that's a safety need; physical abuse; parenting practices has to do with belonging and love needs; family adversity; exposure to violence, domestic and community violence; exposure to sexually explicit media; living in a highly sexualized environment; inconsistent caregiver; and social isolation. So, these are the things that contribute. And if you look at the bottom of this graph, it's saying the same thing. Kids, to survive and thrive, need to have certain basic needs met. And by putting them on a registry, we are taking away self-esteem needs, belonging, sense of community. There's also research to show that kids who are engaged in community are less likely to end up in the criminal justice system in the first place. So to me, it lines up that we cannot treat children the same as we treat adult offenders, because it's a different problem and the solutions are also different.
Yeah, thank you, Patty. False sense of safety. This is something that I think was included on one of the first things Patty sent out. This is something from my perspective really hits close to home. I mean, it's from my perspective a little bit of a wake-up call when it comes to the safety of the registry and what that registry means. And really, at times, the registry can form a false sense of safety or security because there's this thought of knowing who's out there. And especially when it comes to the population, it's been frequent that we're seeing a stranger or somebody we don't know. And so this registry provides this sense where we provide the community a sense of that we know who's out there and we know who's doing this, and that's a false sense of safety, unfortunately.
I'm sorry to interrupt again. There is a question for Janine from Sherry as to what percentage of juveniles are clinically more challenged to rehabilitate, whereas they are classified as borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, psychotic disorder.
Thanks for doing that. I think, Olivia, I was trying to find Sherry's name here to answer it in the chat. If I understand the question is where does the mental illness intersect with likelihood of success in treatment for juveniles who've offended sexually? Am I reading that correctly? If that's the angle, I don't have off the top of my head the concentration of mental illness with juveniles. I can certainly do a lit search on that, and I can bring it back and make it available to Mark and Olivia to post. And at the risk of, I agree with Sheriff and other comments earlier about anecdotal information. There's far more mental illness in adults, generally speaking, that quintessential SPMI, severe persistent mental illness, than there is in juveniles. If you look at Patty's comments of what the antecedents are for juveniles acting out, mental illness is not necessarily targeted there. Certainly difficult upbringings could contribute and exacerbate mental illness, but I don't see it as a majority. But again, I can certainly do a lit search for Stacy or for Sherry and get that to you. I don't know, Brian, do you have other, or Rhonda, if you have a different take on it?
I'd need to do some follow-up too, so I can help in that regard if need be, but nothing to add at this point.
Sounds great. Thanks for the questions. Anything we can't answer you here, we're happy to go back and do the research and get an answer for you. So I know we've had a good team come together on this PowerPoint, so I know that they'll be able to do the research of any questions that come up we can't answer. So couple things just to point out here, that Human Rights Watch that interviewed all those individuals found that contrary to public perception, the empirical evidence suggests that putting youth offenders on registries does not advance community safety. And one of the things that I think is really important to point out, that someone who suspects abuse within the family may be less likely to ask for help and subject family members, including victims, to public exposure. And this is the larger conversation happening around when we know kids are likely to offend against someone that they know or somebody that is close to them, then I think this element is a huge factor to bring into light and to make sure we're upholding, because we want to make sure that kids and victims are getting the services they need. And if the registry is something that is potentially stopping people from coming forward to get those services that they need, I think that's something we have to be aware of. And then this is something actually that I had read a part of this in a sub-work group, because Senator Ingebrigtsen had a question specific to deterrence. And so studies of juvenile registration have found that registration requirements fail to identify juveniles that are at a greater risk for sexual recidivism. And further, the research on the deterrent value of sex offender registration applied to juveniles has consistently shown no general or specific deterrent effect. And so some of that anecdotal thought we have around what deterrence is for kids and does the registry deter this behavior, the research doesn't show that to be true, that does not bear out in the research. And then also just wanted to highlight the CSC working group recommendations. I think it's something that we've always come back to in this work group. And so I put the POR specific reform that was agreed upon by the outcomes subcommittee here, highlighted the fact and bolded, eliminate registration requirement for adjudicated juveniles, and further went on to make sure that we quote brought forward that the POR reform came up in nearly all the working group subcommittees, with reform related to juveniles receiving particular attention given their age, level of maturity, brain development, and nature of offenses. In the outcome subcommittee, there's uniform support for eliminating registration requirement for adjudicated juveniles, but not extended jurisdiction juveniles or juveniles tried as an adult. And just as a reminder, those youth who are extended juvenile jurisdiction or EJJ, those are those blended sentences. And so they have a juvenile disposition, but they have an adult stayed sentence as well. And then of course, juveniles tried as adults are certification cases here in our state. And so just wanted to highlight that as well. We've listed all of our references. I think in our first work group, I conveyed how happy I was that Patty gave us a list of references. And so wanted to make sure that we provided those as well. And I have copies of all of them. So if somebody, is looking at the PowerPoint and is requesting something specifically on there that you can't get access to by Googling it, you can feel free to shoot me an email or let Mark or Olivia know, and I'd be happy to share those resources. I'll also, Olivia, just to make you aware, I'll share that report that really delineates some of the differences between states. And then in my conversation with the national partner, they were also willing to come to present to this group about the differences between the states. And I let them know that I would make this group aware if that's something that you would like to take up on. I think that they focus primarily on juveniles, but have a large base of knowledge depending on the differences between states and what registry looks like and other requirements as well. Any questions? I appreciate that questions came through as we went through, but happy to answer any more questions.
You got a thank you from Nicole. I'm not seeing any questions on my end.
I would like to add a comment, possibly. This, because of the nature of these crimes committed, it's usually someone that the youth knows. I think that there needs to be an attention to, if we propose taking juveniles off registry, there should be some special attention made to the victims of these young offenders, because they are still traumatized, and they need to have some special acknowledgement that we hear you and we're getting this child some help, and there's hope, because most of them, once given that's the goal, is that they never commit another crime. And so that there needs to be a real sensitivity to the victims of the juveniles, because it's probably even more traumatic having it be someone that who you thought you trusted and never suspected of causing this harm. I'm just suggesting that for legislators, because they're going to get some victims who are going to say, buddy did this, and we've got a whole bunch of information that shows us what we need to do. But I think that we also have to have a very big sensitivity to the victims of these youth.
Sheriff?
Sherry?
If the sheriff wants to go first, he can. I think my hand was second. Okay. So Patty, I appreciate that. And I do understand it as well. And in addition, one of the things that I was thinking about as I listened is the word that you use repeatedly is shame. I understand the notion of, the impact on suicidal ideation and all those things that occur in youth. Would we consider a member or some discussion from the Board of Education in one particular way or another to suggest that one of our recommendations is to standardize certain curriculum or certain approaches? And I understand teachers' time, schools' time is limited, but across the state, reducing that shame and awareness at an early age, is there training? Is there support that we are a state that trains early on? No, not me, sort of what are the things that empower, and also draw to the attention from a school guidance counselor / services perspective, children that may be in need, Patty, as you're suggesting, because they're demonstrating signs of this, and that we can stop it before it perpetuates itself. So is there an awareness that we should be suggesting if we believe that the early side of the funnel is a very good stopgap or damming, if you will, to this being something that's hidden versus something that's supported and explained, right? We've seen what Mothers Against Drunk Driving, STAD has done, these things, this awareness at a very early age. Would it not apply in the same way through the educational system as a recommendation from us?
I can just suggest, I love that. Prevention is really the name of the game here. These youth need to be these are teachable tools, boundaries and respect. But when it has the word sex in it, it's hard to pass something. We don't have comprehensive sex education in Minnesota. We don't have, it's hard to pass through the legislature to get that. Some states do have prevention education across the board. I would love to see that. And there are several, nonprofits who do reach out to schools and get the information out there, but not nearly enough. But to me, that is the solution, is getting them out of the game.
And I would suggest that, any off ramping that we discuss or things that we think are important, it would be maybe only half the equation if as a team we didn't suggest some form of, and here's why I say it, Patty, the same thing that you're suggesting, because the amount of digital crime that we see, the amount of sharing of sexual images, and the complete erosion of what's appropriate or not appropriate is very diluted in today's youth because of what internet access has given. And so how do you know when to say no? And we have plenty of cases across the state where both young boys and girls have been, victimized by people they don't know or do know. But I think ultimately, if we empower our kids and don't necessarily say, utilizing the sex term, I do get that. There is a personal space and boundary discussion that I think is a way to angle it, whether you're exposed to a coach, a clergyman, or a teacher, right? Or your own relative. I put it out there as something I think is a great consideration that crosses all of us and is an effective tool. That's all.
Share.
So first, I'm very pleased to see that treatment is becoming more effective and completely supportive of efforts that are going to help treat these offenders and do what we can to make sure they don't recidivate. My concern is when you look at, again, the purpose of the registry, and forgive me for sounding like a broken record. Right now the registry, in my opinion, casts a very wide net for the purpose of encompassing names of potential suspects for us to look at. When we talk about recidivism rates, whether that rate is 3% or 7% or 18% or whatever that rate is, that still means there are people who are going to recidivate. And because we're talking about people, there's no way we can say for sure 100% of anything. We cannot say 100% that these people won't, 100% that these will. My concern, and I guess my rhetorical question I'll put out there, is that when we start considering the people that we're going to pare back from this registry, whether that be an off-ramp, or whether that be juveniles or whatever, that we really think about how certain are we that these changes are going to remove the right people, that they're not going to inadvertently remove that next notorious offender that's going to commit that once in a lifetime or once in a decade heinous crime that we're going to use the registry to try to solve. I think that's the biggest challenge when we talk about narrowing the scope of this net, because this offender registry helps law enforcement, but it definitely is there to assist the victims and the family members that are going to be affected by this next crime. The registry isn't necessarily going to prevent that crime, but that registry is going to help us bring justice to someone who's affected by that crime. And when we talk about paring down who is in that, I really hope people think, how sure are we that we're not eliminating somebody that is going to be in that 2% or 7% or what have you?
Janine, I think you were up next.
Thanks. I agree, Sheriff. I really do. In addition to that, and nobody, I don't think anyone in here is our intention is to miss someone who is going to harm another person. I would move out of that lane to another lane that runs parallel to it, which is, does the system that we created of the registry contribute to individuals offending? And that's the flip side of that same coin. And it's easy to, it's compelling to be in the black and white around catching folk, which we all want that to have happen. To add to the conversation and branch it out, is there unintended inadvertent consequences around this that exist, that people who are on the registry who very likely would not reoffend, that their lives are impacted in such a way that we have poured gasoline on that spark by having them be on that registry? It's a question. It's not either or. Absolutely agree with everything you've said. I do think it's worth us just looking at and considering putting in the false positives to the mix. Have we, to find that one juvenile offender or EJJ individual, do we have 20 other individuals who are now on a path of that spiral that Patty talked about that does contribute to reoffending? It's just a question.
Yep. Patty, I think you were up next.
I wanted to address what Sheriff Heck said about, well, the use of the registry is an aid in solving crimes. And there is also research to show that not only do the juvenile children with problematic sexual behavior almost always victimize someone that they know, and they tend to have fewer victims than adult offenders. So it doesn't necessarily fit into what you're looking at the registry to do. It would be an odd, rare exception that a juvenile was creating those most horrific crimes where you wouldn't know about him. And honestly, it was designed initially to be a law enforcement tool. And if there was a way for law enforcement to have access to some private information that doesn't harm these kids, I don't have a problem with that. It's just everybody else, the whole world wants everything exposed, and that therein lies the problem for these youth. They screwed up and they have a chance to turn their lives around, and we should, in my opinion, allow them every opportunity to do that so there's no more victims. That's the goal.
Sherry?
I also want to respond to Sheriff Heck, who I do agree with. I think that, and again, perhaps I have more of a bias for the reduction of overall criminality as it leads to your accountability as a human from a young age until older. And I understand all the headwinds associated with compliance to some of these challenges. The question that I have more is, if there is offboarding, what is the criteria? Is it stringent enough? Because we all, when I think about failure to register, and I remember early on in our presentations at all ages, when it became an extension, compliance went up from 30 to 90 something. So the choice associated not to register, I just would suggest, I think, I would posture that there may be a perspective that if we all suggest that the forms are simple enough, that there's access and an advocate at the sheriff's departments or with your supervisor, that the choice to not register is just that, a choice. And so I will continue to suggest that reducing criminality or the notion of I'm accountable in society is an important thing that I would ask us not to lose sight of. Accountability is also the cornerstone of great rehabilitation, right? None of us go to a therapeutic research and say, well, hope it works for me. You have to own it. And so number two, the testing component associated or the analytics between what Sheriff Heck says is, I agree, 7 to 10, while it's less or lower, there's still people there. And so how do we provide more analytics to especially in youth when diagnoses are usually done a little bit later in life? How are we ensuring that their track record is headed in the right direction? And I have been involved with testing of youth, and so I know there are certain tools. So that's the question, but also I'll go back to the education component in the schools. And then the third thing is, you know, just to be clear again, the registry itself is not viewable. And I guess the question around when we talk about the registry, it's the crime that's viewable. The registry is only viewable at certain public notification levels. Am I wrong again in this? Or
No, no,
because
you are not wrong.
Okay,
so like the juvenile offenders would not be viewable to the
right,
general public.
So if we're saying that we're looking towards a broader expungement, or we're looking to something that removes them over time, okay, like what are we saying the limiters are? Shame in the community? Well, who knows? If only the police are aware. And if it's the crime that you're concerned with, then we have a, you know, that's what is more viewable. And I keep coming back to that. So I don't have the answer, but I would raise it as, we continue to think the registry is the place where people are getting it. When we run background checks, it isn't that, it's the actual crime that we see.
Sheriff Hack?
I should have included this in my notes when I made my previous comments, but I also agree with what Patty and Janine referred to as far as these collateral consequences for juveniles, in that if there is going to be a change to the registry as it relates to juveniles, I would completely support making it harder for the general public to obtain information. I'm not sure if there are, as we've talked about over the years, other people that have been able to look into this registry, but certainly restricting those to reduce the stigma that's attached to these juveniles is something I support.
So currently, the only individuals who can see the registry are listed in statute. I don't know what, I would have to ask the courts what the protections are around the offenses in the criminal history themselves. Most juvenile criminal history is sealed at a certain age, and so there is also that to take into account. Representative Moeller.
So I had a question about DNA. Do adjudicated juveniles have to give DNA samples?
Has to provide a sample.
Everybody on the registry is required to provide a DNA sample.
But if we took people off the registry, if we took juveniles off the registry, would that DNA sample still need to be provided for adjudicated juveniles?
Depending upon the level of crime, so 299C.115, I believe, is the statute related to DNA collection. So depending upon the grade of crime, yes. But again, it would be completely dependent upon how they were adjudicated, what the crime was. And then of course, there's always the actual difficulty of collecting DNA and, you know, that process. So it would depend, I guess, is the best answer I can give.
Yeah, no, and the reason I'm asking is because when we talk about what other tools can law enforcement use, and you know, trying to figure out if they have a case where there is not a known offender, and we're hearing that a lot of juvenile cases, the offenders are known to the victim. We do have DNA evidence as a potential tool that I'm not sure we had as much use of that tool when the registry was founded, just because of how much DNA evidence has grown over the years. So I just wanted to point that out.
And folks, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to start curbing the discussion just a little bit due to time. So Katrina, I believe you were up next, and then Patty.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I think anyone on this work group, I think can agree that accountability is necessary. I push back on this notion that because it is not open to all community members or open to the public, that it somehow does not impact a kid. If I'm 10 years old and I commit a behavior, or I participate in behavior that gets me on the registry, and then I become 18 years old and I'm still on the registry, and I have to take into account my registry status into where I potentially would choose to go to college or what my opportunities are for college. Those are the things that I think are really important to us in this conversation. You know, some states, for example, have limited registry requirements for juveniles in their own state. But if a kid is required to register in their own state and then they come to that state, then those registry requirements are different. So you are impacting these kids in ways much further into their adulthood than when they're actually committing these offenses. And so from my perspective, if I'm 10, 11, 12, if I'm a kid and I'm trying to further myself and go on and do all the things that we hope kids will do, go to college, get a job, find stable housing, the fact that this isn't open to the public doesn't get rid of those things. It doesn't make those things go away. Kids are still having to deal with those things regardless of it being open to the public or not. And then I'll also just point out, you know, Angie sent us out a list of the collateral consequences, and I think those are really important to remember because those are collateral consequences that are in statute that are specific to the registry. And I think that's really important when we're looking at kids specifically to keep those in mind.
And one thing I do just want to delineate again as we continue to discuss is the difference between the registry and somebody failing a background check. Because a lot of those same, you know, collateral consequences, so you're talking about school, if you apply to college, you also have to attest to your criminal background history. So there are, I think we're continuously kind of interweaving this discussion, but I do want to remind folks that there's separate and aside from the registry, there will still be that criminal history. And Patty?
I agree with what Katrina just said. The impact on these kids' lives is huge if they are, I'm appalled that Minnesota has 10-year-olds, that even in law, that we would put 10-year-olds on a registry, because I just was on a field trip with my granddaughters who are in 5th grade, 10 years old. And these kids do stupid things. I watched. They're not thinking that forebrain, you know, prefrontal cortex isn't developed, and they're going to do dumb stuff. And that we would even think to put a 10-year-old, and if it's in the statute, we have to own that. And I think that in itself is appalling. The federal law is 14 with certain criteria, and how on earth we got it down to 10. But I just think that I agree with Katrina. This impacts their lives, whether it be public. A lot of people know that they committed a sexual offense, and it's going to change their lives in many ways. We want to turn it so it changes it in a positive way. So that's all. I believe in children. I don't know at what age do you give up on your own kids? And I just think that it's a little outrageous when we get unforgiving of these kids because they did something stupid.
So I'm going to have to move us on. I'm sorry, guys. We really do, especially if we're going to talk about next steps. Oh, Renee, I'm sorry. Renee, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Awesome. So I just thought this is worth mentioning. So just really quick. So they see the criminal history, right? So the next question, I've said this before, is if you're trying to rent, is do you register? Because then that registration could, and I know this in some of the communities in Hennepin County, it triggers law enforcement to circle areas, right? To circle that area. That then creates concern for neighbors that are saying, why are you circling my area so much? So those are some of the impacts. I also had a situation really quickly that a young man or juvenile in which where that family lived, law enforcement would frequent their home, which then of course creates what's happening within that home. And you know that neighbors are thinking about this is what's likely happening in that home. So even though they can only see that, there are things that are happening in the community that lead people to believe that something's going on there, and it doesn't take them long to figure out what it is. So I just wanted to say that because I've had those experiences with some clients that I've supervised. I'm done. Olivia,
Okay.
thank you.
Yeah, no, of course. Sorry, I didn't notice your hand at first there. Chairs, I'm not sure how you wanted to proceed having this discussion about next steps. So I'm not sure how you wanted to start this. Angie, Stacy, Sheriff, if you had any thoughts or feedback, just as an FYI, the subgroups, as you know, are only scheduled through mid-November. And we have the report that is due on January 15th. And so, chairs, I'm not sure if you wanted to take this away or how you wanted to handle this.
Well, I just need to give you a heads up that I have a 10:45 court hearing. I'm going to have to log off in about 10 minutes to get on to that. I think really the question's going to be, depending on how much more we want to do that we think we won't have the ability to do in this time frame. Do we want to ask for some kind of extension? And what we talked about yesterday is, if we do that, I think we need to know how that would implicate, and maybe Representative Bowler might know something about this, but how that would implicate the timing of things with the legislature itself. Would we just ask for some kind of shorter extension, or would we keep the timing kind of as it is and recommend some more work in the future on these issues?
Representative Mueller.
Yeah, and I'm on a couple different working group and task forces. So you have to remind me, when is the report currently said to be due?
It is scheduled for January 15th due date.
Okay, and thank you. And then the reason for that was in order to be able for us to write the actual language, it has to go through, even if this group comes up with great model language, we still have many steps we have to go through to get that language drafted and ready for the start of session, which is January 31st. But we also want to get it right. And so if the group decides they need more time, I'm fine with that. But the flip side to that is, the longer we wait, the less likely it is that we're going to be able to get something through this next session, and that we would be perhaps pushing it off to a following year.
And what we talked about is that maybe on some of the main issues, we could come up with some proposed kind of majority minority language, like on the issue with the juveniles, on the issue with the same set of circumstances, on the issue with the extension. Some of the things that were, at least in agreement, should be maybe looked at. So maybe in some of the simpler things, we could come to some kind of recommendation, but then with a recommendation for more work in the future on the data or something like that. I know, Stacy, I know you were the one kind of talking about that being a possibility.
And I wanted to just note that the BCA has dedicated 3 full-time staff to this. And we do not have the ability to continue dedicating 3 full-time staff and go through legislative session. These are the same staff that are doing all of the work. And so when we talk about moving forward, just know that we are going to have a serious discussion about our resources and our ability to continue. Representative Mueller, I believe you were up next, and then Jim.
Yeah, and I'll just say, if we do extend this and need to attach more funding to that, we certainly can make that request. So we just to put that out there, Olivia.
Jim?
I appreciate the BCA's position, but it was the BCA's decision to put 3 people on this commission. I mean, my agency just has me. So I don't find that as a compelling argument.
You're
particularly.
right, and we are all the three experts, and we are also the ones needed to pull the data, and we are also the ones who actually use the registry. So
Always like
you're right,
being
we
above-
did choose to put three.
I mean, I frankly, I see this as the BCA's got three people here to protect the BCA's interests. And I don't feel that we've ever had any discussion about what could be done, what can't be done. When we've asked for data, no data's been provided, which I think is has been a big problem.
With all due respect, Jim, we have provided data as best as we can. We don't have data. We have repeatedly told you that and everybody else on this work group. We have also not been provided any additional assistance to do so. On top of that, we are here as the people who implement, work on, and use the registry. So if I don't understand what your point is, other than the fact that you're right, we have three people here to make sure that you have all of the facts and all of the information. You can make any decision that you personally choose based upon that. Patty?
I don't know if I was next, but I have two questions. One question is, do you have an idea of how much it costs to keep a person on the registry for, annually? Or is it vary, I suppose, by?
No, I mean, once they're entered into the registry, the annual cost would be sending out the letter, those kinds of things. But we don't personally have a way to track individual law enforcement agencies' work based on that. Because it would be the individual law enforcement agencies that are doing the check-ins, those kinds of things.
I was just thinking that if there was an off-ramp for some of the people who have not committed a crime in 25 years and if there's a way for them to appeal, have not had a criminal conviction and think that they determined to get off, that there might be a dollar savings in making the registry a little bit smaller. But the second point I wanted to make was the registry was created, as the sheriff said, to, solve crimes. It was not created to come up with data. We need that. And I think that we're going to have to build in, and that should be one of the recommendations to the legislature, that is that we fund some data to support, to be able to answer some of the questions. Is it working? Is it working, and is it worth the cost of some of this? Or are some changes needed that we could address down the road? But I hear you, Olivia. You guys have been running like crazy to answer our questions, that which you were not created to provide. So I think that we need to look at that. That could be another subcommittee of what is it that we need to know, and how can we fund that to make it happen? Because you can't have a program this big, this life impacting, you can't evaluate it. And it was not created to do the evaluation piece. It was track addresses so that it could help solve crimes. So I think that that's a need that we should consider writing into the recommendation.
Nate?
Thanks, Olivia. And I did send you an email, which is kind of a proposal for something we could do, I think, now with existing resources on answering some of these data questions. And
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry, Nate.
No. I sent it during the meeting, literally, so you couldn't have possibly read it. But let me just sort of give you a sketch of what I'm thinking, and people can shoot it down if they think it's a good idea or a bad idea. But basically, we've got data in the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission, so we could take everybody who's convicted of a sex offense, say over a 10-year time period, and figure out, get from the courts the date that they were charged, right? And then we could send that list of people to you. We could send you their names and dates of birth and the dates they were charged. And then you could look up to see, were they on the registry on the date they were charged? Because if they, I mean, I'm assuming they're all on the registry now, but were they on the registry on the date they were charged? Because that should kind of narrow it down to who, and the question that I'm trying to answer is, is the registry working as a crime-solving tool? And presumably, if they were convicted and they weren't on the registry at the date they were charged, then obviously the registry didn't help solve the crime. So So then somebody, and I guess if you've got 3 full-timers there, maybe you could look up all those police reports on however long that list is of people who were on the registry on the date they were charged and who were eventually convicted of a sex offense and sentenced within the last decade. You could look at all those police reports and say, did the registry help in this investigation? So we could actually have some data rather than just anecdotes on how effective the registry is as a crime fighting tool. That's what I would suggest. Yeah.
Okay.
With all due
I have to
respect,
sign
we have
off.
3 people. Okay.
Olivia, I have to sign off. I just want to say goodbye and let me know what happens. And yeah, I was going to say, Olivia, Katie, and Josh, this is not their full-time job. They all have very busy full-time jobs, and they're putting a lot of time into this committee too. So it's not like they can take a list of 10,000 charges. They would have to go one by one to look at those charges. So it's not something that they're going to have time to do. Let me know if I stepped on your toes as far as that goes, Olivia. Bye, everyone. Have to go to court.
Yeah, with all due respect, we do have full-time positions that are outside of the working group. And so no, we cannot sit here and scroll through 33,000 case files and individual charging documents. Sorry. I'm happy to look at the request and talk to our folks about what may or may not be feasible. But no, I cannot say that I can scroll through all charging documents. Patty, I think you were up next.
Nate, I love your suggestion. That is, it's achievable. What we might need to find as a person or some partnership with a college or somebody to be able to do that. Clearly, I hear the BCA is text and what they're able to do it now, but the information's there. I love that. I think it's a great idea because I think it's been my personal experience that the people that were the biggest suspects in Jacob's abduction case, which would be a really good reason to use the registry, none of our final suspects were on the registry, including the man who did it. So it didn't solve the crime. It didn't help, but we didn't have that tool. But even if we'd had that tool, they wouldn't have been on the registry. There were no priors. So I think that's a really key piece of information. And you've got 2 agencies who could do that. So yay, thank you.
Nate, I think you were up next, or was it Katrina? I'm sorry, guys.
That's Nate.
Yeah, I was just going to do a quick
Okay.
follow-up to what I was saying. And maybe I didn't understand the extent to which you have resources, and I'm sorry if I misspoke that, but I kind of envisioned it as a 2-phase thing. The first one is just matching up the names and dates with your registry and seeing, we're looking at this list of people, were these people on the registry on this date? So that I don't think should be that time consuming. The time consuming part really would depend on how long that list is from phase 1. How many people who were convicted of sex offenses were on the registry on the date they were convicted, right? I'm sorry, the date they were charged. And then depending on how long that list is, it would be time consuming or not time consuming to then go to the police reports and see, did the registry actually help in the investigation?
So a couple of things, as we have mentioned before, we really don't have historical data beyond 2014. So that is the reality of that. Also on the predatory offender registry, it does not loop over to criminal history. So we would have to have somebody individually scroll through each and every person. Again, I'm happy to check and see if there is something different, but just these are the things that we have bumped into in all of our data requests and have repeatedly stated.
Right. What I'm saying is I would give you the list of names and dates, and then you just check that list to see, were you on the registry on that date? That's all I'm saying.
And we don't have anything behind 2014, and that requires somebody to sit there with thousands and thousands of names. Katrina?
Yeah, this may be a question for the chairs. I know that there's a data request that was received from the courts, and I'm just wondering when the rest of the work group is going to get that data request. And then just to follow up on that Excel spreadsheet, I have some data requests that I would like to submit, but I don't want to submit data requests that have already been submitted, and I don't want to, continue to bombard Mark and Olivia's email box with things that have already been taking place. So just want to keep that on the radar.
Stacy?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Oh, Olivia, were you going to respond? I'm sorry.
No, I just was on mute trying to call on you.
Oh, okay. Couple of things. I recognize and hear what you're saying, Olivia, in terms of resources being super limited. That makes sense. I guess my concern, and this isn't a indictment of the BCA. It's more, my concern is that we've got a statute where we've got, BCA implementing the statute, running the day-to-day. And we've got this working group, which I'm super grateful for. Representative Mueller, thank you for getting this working group launched. That to me was like the biggest success of my career in terms of being able to help with that, at least in the last couple of years. But my concern has always been the brevity of the group, that it was 4 months. I had that concern from the outset because it is such a complex statute and there's so many layers to it. I feel like we were given the 4 months to do data requests, get information, which the courts and the BCA have been responding to the extent that they have information, because we know that there's certain information that we want to know that doesn't exist in a current form, right? Like we don't have like a pocket of data. And that's what this tracker is going to do. The spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet is, here are the requests, here's what's been fulfilled, here's what doesn't exist. And so that tracker is super important to know where we are now at month 2 in terms of, Katrina, so she doesn't send more requests that have already been made and maybe fulfilled, maybe they haven't been because the data doesn't exist. But my concern is that we are operating in a dearth of information and a dearth of time. We're running out of time in terms of, some of the issues. I think that looking very specifically at going forward, what do we do? Can we make some legislative proposals on the more simple statutory pieces? I think we can. It will probably be in a majority minority report because I don't think we have a consensus on those things, and that's okay. We can still make suggested language changes with the understanding that there's a minority report, and the minority report will be able to articulate the concerns with the majority report. So I think on those, maybe on juveniles and maybe the false imprisonment, same set, we can get there on that. We might be able to get there on the restart. I think we're getting closer on the 10-year restart for any conviction resulting in imprisonment. I think we've made good headway in that subgroup. I think that's requirements. Is that requirements? Anyone? Mark? It is.
I think it was requirement. Yeah.
We've done some good work there. Again, consensus is a tough thing, and that's okay too. So we might be able to make a proposal there, but I feel like Representative Mueller, this issue of resources, like I hear Olivia loud and clear, like, we've got our jobs and we're also trying to do this. And that makes sense. But then it's like, well, did we set up a work group that actually isn't we can maybe achieve a few things, but to this question of, is it working as intended? Is it successful? Are we creating harm in certain areas? Where are we solving harm? Where are we enhancing public safety? Where are we not enhancing public safety? Those questions, I don't know that we can get there in 4 months because we don't have data. And there's other pieces to this that we just don't know. there's I think we know what we don't know, but then there may be a whole group of, things that we don't know, even what we don't know. So my suggestion would be, in an ideal world, if I could wave my magic wand, it would be, can we get more time and funding? Because obviously BCA is telling us, and I would assume that they would say, we don't have it, we're tapped out, is what I'm hearing. So we can't create a working group where we're pulling on an agency that's tapped out, because then the working group isn't going to work. We're not going to be able to do the work. So those would be my suggestions, is that we do a majority minority with the provisions that we can come to, some majority, positions on. And then for the other things that we can't quite get done, or the data that we need going forward, that we see if we can get more time and resources to get the data.
Well, I do just want to mention a couple of things. First of all, we do administer the Predatory Offender Registry. So anytime there is a conversation with the registry, we want to and need to be a part of it. So that is why we have 3 staff here. Additionally, I do want to also just say that we do have a couple of public comments. I'm going to go to Sheriff Heck and then to Sherry, and then I'm unfortunately going to have to call time just so that we can get some public comment in.
I'll be brief. I think I will echo Stacy's idea that we come up with proposals that we have broad support for, and that we have a minority majority on the other things, and that our report to the legislature that we get done in January include a request for additional resources and statistically validated research into the data that we're looking for.
Sherry?
That was exactly my comment. In addition, if there's anything that we have a complete consensus on, that would also be enlightening to know. Like, there may be a few notions here that we are 100% aligned, and or if tweaks were made, we would be all willing to suggest there is consensus, majority, minority. So those 3 things. In addition, the other thing that I know we brought up on one of the first meetings that I feel pretty strongly about is, at some point in time, we need to recommend the possibility for an IT system, that works better across all integrative points, not only the registry, because this is clearly going to be an ongoing issue. And if we're a world of data analytics, how we can operate with 4 separate systems and expect to have targeted analytics associated with what we're doing, where you look at other states, would we suggest that a byproduct of this is a recommendation that we look at a national incident-based reporting system, or things that are more connected that are used in other states, or even across national agencies, because that component is going to continue to hinder the work ongoing for many task force to come if we don't make a recommendation on an IVRS system or something along those lines.
Okay, public comment. Thank you all for your discussions. Sarah, I believe you were up first.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, and just appreciate the opportunity to hear some of this discussion. I do have to acknowledge I had to step away a little bit in the midst of it, so apologies if I missed something that is relevant to what I wanted to share. But I just wanted to lift up what's been said about the harm that the registry causes for kids, and the wide net that this law casts in Minnesota. And I think I hear comments about wanting to improve public safety and ensure community safety. And in fact, I think that when we look at the research and at the data, that what that tells us is that removing kids from the registry is actually what will accomplish that. I hear the concern about making sure that I hear folks saying, well, we have to cast a wide net to make sure that we catch that one child who might be at high risk to reoffend in the future, and yet at what cost, and I think what the research and the data shows us pretty consistently is the cost in terms of barriers and lifelong consequences for children who are on the registry, who are at really low risk to recidivate.
really does outweigh that any benefit from maintaining the registry as it exists. I also just want to say, as somebody so I'm the executive director at the Legal Rights Center, and I'm an attorney. I've represented kids in the legal system, both here and previously out in Massachusetts for 14 years. I've represented a lot of kids who have ended up subject to the registry and seen the consequences of that, done a lot of work with other stakeholders in the system on this issue specifically. And I think there's broad support from, yes, I can acknowledge I bring the perspective of a defense attorney, but, when I speak with prosecutors, when I speak with judges, when I speak with probation, there's really broad support for removing kids from the registry because it's an evidence-based approach, because we have shared values around improving safety, and because we have to acknowledge that, Minnesota has some of the worst racial disparities in the country as it relates to youth justice. And so who are we talking about here? And who is this impacting Black and brown children? And the way that our law is written is deeply problematic. And I know you all know that, but like when you think about it's a required registration, when you think about the fact that even if the charge that would have been the registrable offense gets dismissed, but they get adjudicated on another charge that arose out of the same circumstances that you're looking at registration, is really, really problematic. And as somebody who has sat with children to try and explain this and to their families and to explain the impact that this has, I just want to add my voice to say that from a community perspective, and particularly the Legal Rights Center having been founded by Black community and the Native community coming together, this is a critical issue for kids and families in our communities, and ask you to really strongly consider recommending removing children from the registry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ashley?
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley. I am with the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. And I was excited to hear some prevention being brought up. However, I guess I would just like to encourage that if this group is looking to have a discussion around child sexual assault prevention, Patty, I'm thinking maybe inviting Allison from your organization to come talk about that, because I do just want to highlight the importance of child abuse, child sexual assault prevention that really puts the responsibility on adults to be protecting children. And that does not, rely solely on safe touch or self-defense of children needing to protect themselves, but really looking at prevention curriculum that, again, like I said, puts the responsibility on adults to protect children. And I am happy also to engage with other members of our coalition that are doing prevention, if you'd like to have a discussion around that. Another thing is I'm not necessarily providing an opinion on this. I just wanted to kind of add some information around domestic violence and sexual violence. And just to say that sometimes these two types of violence, they're not always separate, and a lot of times they go hand in hand. As the Sexual Assault Coalition, when I'm training advocates who are responding to victim survivors of domestic violence, to say, there is likely sexual violence that is also happening within this relationship, is that victim survivors of physical domestic violence aren't often reporting the sexual violence. We have, stigmas and taboos around sexual violence. Just to cite some statistics here, that 34% of all reported rapes or sexual assault victimizations were committed by an intimate partner. Of men who are forced to penetrate someone else, 44.8% reported an intimate partner as the offender, and that's from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And of course, sometimes people who are victim survivors of intimate partner sexual violence aren't identifying it as sexual violence because of our, stigmas around our misconceptions as a society that your intimate partner cannot sexually assault you. So I just wanted to also say, that domestic violence and sexual violence are related, and we know most likely to be sexually assaulted by someone that we know and love and trust. So just wanted to say that. So thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. I know we have a question about meeting the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. I believe there are currently holds on the calendar. My understanding was that we were not meeting past mid-November as the small groups. But I think that was part of the discussion that we needed to have, is how long and what we wanted to dive into. So at the next chairs meeting, we can discuss, given this feedback, what should be done, and we can make amendments to the calendar based upon that, if that works for folks. Okay, thank you everyone so much for your time today, and have a good one.